Got everybody, right?
Hello, hello.
Okay, so Dale, you're going to be
To the left?
straight. You're going to be on the far right. You're going to be in the middle.
All
Okay,
right.
far right, that sounds right.
That's right.
And the middle sounds like.
Okay, hold up. You good? Yeah, let's walk them up and see how it sounds on stage.
Okay.
Come on up.
Seems a lot big. Which way do you want us to go? That way, okay. Hey, Todd.
No Quant isn't here to yell at us. God, I wish I had my glasses.
Well, good morning, everybody. We're very... I'm sorry.
Turn this off so we don't distract anybody. Keep going.
Okay.
I don't want to compete with Chris Liu.
Okay. Well, good morning, everybody. We're here to talk about Iran and Iran's relationship with the United States with two very distinguished scholars and also practitioners of international relations. The first on my far left is Eric Edelman. He is the Roger Hertog Distinguished Practitioner in Residence at the School of Advanced International Studies in Washington, D.C., part of Johns Hopkins University. I, in fact, got my master's there many years ago. And it's a great school. He's also been the Undersecretary of State, Undersecretary of Defense, I should say, for policy, and also U.S. Ambassador to Turkey under the George W. Bush administration. Ambassador to Finland as well, earlier on, and a Yale PhD, 1981. And Ray Takeyh, is that how I pronounce it?
That's fine.
Okay. He is a senior fellow of Middle East Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, a PhD from Oxford as well, and he served as senior advisor on Iran at the State Department, an author of numerous excellent books on Iran, including a recent book, Guardians of the Revolution, Iran and the World in the Age of the Ayatollahs, Oxford University Press, 2009. Without further ado, I want to turn it over to both Ray and Eric, who will talk for somewhere around 20 minutes, and then the three of us will have a 20-minute dialogue or so, and then we'll open it up for discussion. Sounds good? All right.
Well, let me start with a couple of comments about how the book came about, and then I'll turn it over to Ray, and then come back to me before we go back to Dale. And first, let me just say it's great to be back at the Miller Center. Thanks to Dale for moderating this discussion. It's good to see some old friends in the audience, and at least no enemies that I know of yet. Some neutral, however. This book came about in a kind of funny way. I was approached by one of my former bosses in the Foreign Service, Charlie Hill, a legendary Foreign Service officer who was George Shultz's longtime executive assistant chief of staff when Shultz was Secretary of State. Charlie had been my first boss in the Foreign Service in Tel Aviv, and he is now one of the three gray eminences of the Grand Strategy program at Yale, along with Paul Kennedy and John Lewis Gaddis. And Charlie asked me if I would be willing to write a short book for a series that he and Russell Berman edit for the Hoover Institution, and the book would be about Iran and U.S. strategic interactions. And I demurred a bit. I mean, I said, look, I've written a lot about the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, and I have some views about U.S.-Iranian relations, but I'm not an Iranist, and I really don't have the ability to write with expertise about Iran per se. I said, but I do have a frequent co-author of op-eds about the Iran deal who is a real Iranist, and maybe we could do something together. And Charlie said that would be great. And so I suborned Ray into this project. We, I think, had actually a good time doing it, because I think we were able to talk about a couple of different things that frequently are not discussed in the debate about Iran, which is the very nature of this revolution and what has made it particularly problematic for Americans to deal with, as well as some of the very interesting, unique characteristics of the U.S.-Iranian relationship that have made Iran loom much larger in U.S. national security policy than I think most people have realized. So let me turn it over to Ray to talk about the revolution itself and its peculiar characteristics, and I'll come back then and talk a bit about the U.S.-Iranian interaction, and then we can go back to Dale, to you to probe us.
Thanks. It's really very good, very privileged for me to be here. I'm actually, as I was mentioning before we started, I'm a consumer of the oral histories that Miller Center does. And one of my hobbies is to listen to the tapes at my lunchtime. And in the past year, there has been some reorganization of tapes, so it's difficult for me to navigate it. But the tapes that I listen to the most are the ones that are clearest in expression, the Johnson tapes, because the other ones tend to be more difficult to listen to because just the technology of it. So this is the second time I've been here. The last time I was here, I was an invitation of the late Ruhi Ramazani, who had been at the University of Virginia for many decades. He used to joke that he came here with Thomas Jefferson. So it's a privilege for me to be here. But also it's a privilege for me to have worked with Eric for a long time in various capacities. I'm sort of, at this point, finishing a book on the revolution, the original revolution, so I say a few things about it. This would work better if I had my glasses. The 1979 revolution in Iran, if you kind of go back to the 1970s, the sort of 72, 78, 79, and you kind of try to figure out what the problems of the society were that caused it for it to revolt. There are two questions about the revolution that I think you can only speculate on. Nobody can offer a satisfactory answer to these two questions, and they tend to be quite central to the debate. Number one, why did in 1978-79 about 30 million Iranians decide that they no longer want an institution that had been around for 2,500 years? In the past, there had been problems with the monarchs, but not the institution of the monarchy. Why did they decide, root and branch, that they want that institution to go away? The second is, how did an exiled 78-year-old cleric exercise such political hegemony over an opposition that was very diverse? Those two are central questions to understanding the revolution. People have speculated on it. I haven't seen a satisfactory answer. I can give you some responses to it, which I don't find entirely persuasive, but let me try. Number one, if you kind of go back to Iran of the 1970s, behind all the glitter of modernization and so forth, there was a religious revival taking place in the country. And actually it was taking place throughout the Middle East. But it certainly was taking place throughout the country. If you look at the religious books, were topping the bestseller list. The mosques, unlike today, were filled on Commemoration Day, and Shia Islam is the perfect religion for political protest because it has about 100 calendar days of commemoration, which could easily be manipulated for political purposes. And so you begin to see religion being used not just as a system of belief, but as an ideology of dissent. And that essentially you begin to see how Islamic revolution of 1979 has often been described as being hijacked by the clerics, that Iranian people wanted liberalism, democracy, and so forth, and the revolution was instead hijacked by a small coterie of clerics in the aftermath of its triumph. Actually, and this is something that many exiles tend to reject, it wasn't a promise of liberalism that was hijacked, it was a promise of Islamic governance that was delivered. primary slogans of the revolution were Istiqlal, Azadi, Hukumat Islami. Istiqlal, independence, Azadi, freedom, Hukumat Islami, Islamic government. And Khomeini, to his credit, was not a person who concealed his views. He was openly contemptuous of liberalism, and he had published his series of lectures in 1970, I believe, that most people claim they never saw. Widener Library at Harvard had a copy. The failing New York Times actually profiled it in December 1978. And when you would ask him, I'll get to the contemporary stuff, but the way when Khomeini got to Paris, and I don't want to divert too much, he gave 132 interviews after the government of France had promised he wouldn't. And the way interviews were conducted, you submitted your questions in advance, and there were no follow-ups allowed, except when some scholars, such as Sayyid Ajouman and others, would go see him, and they knew theology and fiqh and so on, he would tell them exactly what he thinks. Marvin Zonis, retired professor in Chicago, the only person I know who's met both Shah and Khomeini, he said he came out with hair on fire after he met Khomeini. So the Iranian Revolution of 1979 was about developing an Islamic government. Now, people might not have known the particularities of that government, but everybody wanted an Islamic government. And that's why the revolution has lost its core ideological element, because it's actually delivered on its promise. It established an Islamic government, and with all its particularities and all its compromises and so on. The second thing that we noticed in 1970s in Iran is mosque as a national network. In the 1970s in Iran, if I get the figures right, there were about 9,000 mosques. I want to say about 90,000 clergymen and about 11,000 seminary students. No political party could match that national network. And the mosques all become sort of politicized at about the same time. And this is reflected in both the CIA papers, assessments, as well as the Shah secret police. And it's often suggested that mosque was a privileged sanctuary, which is not true. The Shah secret police was similar to Stasi. They surveilled everybody. There's an Islamic Republic, as I was mentioning, has released a lot of the Savak papers. I have 25 volumes on the revolution in my office. There is one volume of Savak papers that has to do with the women of the court. The Shah spied on his wife, his mother, his mistresses, the aide, the maids, everybody. And so the mosque was not a sanctuary that was privileged. They knew exactly what was happening in there, the secret police. But you can close down the office of a two-day party, the Communist Party. You can close down the office of a secular party. How do you close down a mosque with a centrality in the community? And how do you close down 9,000 mosques? And the Shah secret police people do debate this. Let's close down this mosque. And so, well, if you close down this mosque, there'll be other mosques. You can't close down an institution of that centrality which is dispersed throughout the country. And if that institution becomes politicized, you're in deep trouble. At the time, because of the religious revival, the institution is packed every day. And by packed, I mean you have some of the mosques in Tehran who may have about 15,000 people coming. So what does this mean for the revolution today? It was a promise kept, and Iranian people have developed buyer's remorse. I think the revolution sustains itself in a number of ways. Number one of the things we talk about is the way foreign policy is used to sustain a certain domestic arrangement. And for whatever category of people that continue to believe in that revolution, they believe in its mission to be exported. And the Iranians have never wavered from that. The second unusual thing about this revolution is that it hasn't followed the model that we tend to anticipate revolutions follow, China, Vietnam, and others. I do think that China has kind of captured and colonized our imagination about how these societies act. And they almost never act like the Chinese. We always think that these societies eventually develop forfeit their revolutionary legacy for other concerns. Iran doesn't. We often think that these regimes are capable of reforming themselves because that's what the Chinese did. Almost every reform movement in history of the Middle East has failed. The Soviet Union was never without a reform movement after Stalin. It was also never with a reform movement that succeeded. We always assume because the Chinese succeeded in reforming their economic arrangements that other countries can do so. So the Iranian Revolution has maintained its vitality and has not forfeited that ideological values. The question is why the Chinese and others abandoned that and the Iranians never did. I think probably because the revolution and religion have been sort of mixed together. I mean, it's easy to become an ex-Marxist. That's just intellectual maturity. It's harder to be an ex-Shiite. That's apostasy. It's an apostasy that's exercised by a large sum of people, but for a core, dedicated group of people, the revolution is what it was promised to be, creating government of God on earth. And that government of God on earth is a revolution without borders. I mean, everybody deserves that. So its export is contingent on its domestic vitality and the inability of people to move away from it, or at least the core devotees of the regime. That to me is kind of an interesting aspect of it. And therefore it makes Iran Islamic Republic is a very problematic and unusual, if not an extraordinary international actor that has continually eluded American efforts to come to terms with it. And with that, I'll turn to American efforts who have not come to terms with it. Well, Eric has come to terms with it.
I haven't come to terms with the revolution, clearly. Thank you, Ray. Edward J. Epstein once wrote a book about American news called News from Nowhere, in which he decried the fact that Americans consume a lot of news without context. And I think frequently news about Iran appears to be news from nowhere. I mean, something will happen, you know, a synagogue will be bombed in Argentina, or we have a hostage crisis, or we have the joint comprehensive plan of agreement, and it makes news, or the president gets out of the joint comprehensive plan of agreement and it makes news, and then it sort of subsides again. What was interesting as we went back and looked at the history of this was that Iran has really played an outsized role in U.S. foreign policy and national strategy since 1945. And if you look at it decade by decade, you can see that, for example, when President Truman decided he was going to stop babying the Soviets and make them adhere to their wartime agreements, one of the first places that he chose to do that was in Iran in 1945-46. And so the Iran crisis, along with the Turkish Straits crisis, is one of the initial crises that marks the breakdown of the wartime Grand Alliance and the advent of the Cold War. In the 1950s, President Eisenhower chose to rely much more on covert action, and Iran and the restoration of the Shah in 1953 is sort of the poster child for the Eisenhower administration's use of covert action. In the 1960s, the Shah's white revolution becomes a case study in the Kennedy-Johnson administration's effort to wield modernization theory and the stages of economic growth as a means for competing with the Soviet Union and the Third World, and looking for cases to show the superiority of the Western way as opposed to the command economy and the Soviets. It's even a subject of discussion between Kennedy and Khrushchev in their first and only summit meeting in June of 1961. At the end of the 60s and in the early 70s, President Nixon came into office committed to reducing America's role in the world and relying more on alliances, which he described in a speech he gave in Guam in 1969, which became known as the Nixon Doctrine. And probably, although the Nixon Doctrine really was about East Asia and drawing down from Vietnam, probably the best example of the Nixon Doctrine at work, which was the idea that we would have regional allies step up and become the first line of defense rather than have the United States be the first line of defense, was the Shah's Iran. And in that sense, what we did with the Shah's Iran in the 1970s in terms of military arms sales, et cetera, may have gone a long way to help destabilize it. I'll wait to see Ray's book on this period come out with great interest on that score. So we see right up to the revolution that Iran is sort of symptomatic of the larger U.S. approach to the third world. After the revolution, that actually continues because the U.S. is very preoccupied with rogue states, pariah states after the end of the Cold War, states that might aspire to have weapons of mass destruction and nonproliferation and counterproliferation, and Iran sort of hits all of those notes. So it's not something that is purely a factor of the revolution and the hostage crisis. This is something that has been very central to U.S. national strategy, I would say, since 1945, and in particular since the end of the Cold War and the two Gulf Wars. Iran has loomed even larger in the Middle East, a region for which the United States has assumed greater responsibility over a period of years. That's a matter of some contention now. The new national defense strategy that was released by Secretary Mattis in January of 2018 suggests the United States can take more risk in the Middle East in order to prioritize return of great power competition with Russia and China in Europe and Asia. But my own view is it's going to be a little bit more difficult to extricate ourselves from this region than people might think, and Iran is very much one of the reasons why that is the case, because Iran's effort to establish its own mastery in the region is driving much of the turmoil and change in the region that requires some outside force to mitigate it, and traditionally that force has been the United States. We'll see whether that continues to be the case, because as we continue the pattern of the previous administration and under the Trump administration of retrenching and withdrawing from the Middle East, other forces are filling that vacuum. But unfortunately, the forces tend to be forces like Russia and Iran, and that is leading to more, I would argue, rather than less turmoil in the region. So this has been an important part of U.S. national security policy for a long time, and I think Ray and I think, unfortunately, it's going to continue to be looming in the agenda of both this administration and whatever administration follows after it. Ray, do you want to, should we talk a little bit about the strategy that we talk about adopting?
I was hoping you might just say a little bit more specifically about your recommendations in the last chapter.
So I'll start, but Ray, please chime in and add and subtract from what I'm saying. One, we think that the United States needs a integrated strategy. One of the mistakes we think the Obama administration made was prioritizing the nuclear issue above all others, because it's impossible to abstract the nuclear issue from the rest of Iran's behavior, both at home and abroad. And because the nature of the regime, as Ray was arguing earlier, is so essential to understand its interaction with the rest of the region. This is not, this was a revolution, as it were, by Islamic Trotskyites. I mean, it was a revolution dedicated to export. There has not been, nor does it seem possible to us, to be a variant of Khomeinism in one country, as you had with Stalin. It's a revolution without a thermidor or borders to add to what Ray said. And so that requires a comprehensive approach, not just a focus on the nuclear, as important as the nuclear is. We also think that the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Agreement suffered from some enormous drawbacks as an arms control arrangement, which we can go into in some detail. Dale, if you want to probe us on that, we can get into the specifics. And as a result, we would argue for both pressure on those elements of the agreement that seem to us to be lacking, which include no real effort to constrain Iran's ballistic missile program, the rather short-term time limits that the agreement contains of 10 and 15 years, and we are now already 4 years into this agreement. So 10 and 15 years as of 2015 seem even shorter now because we're talking about 6 and 9 years, and time flies when you're dealing with nuclear weapons. Third, we think support for democratization in Iran, for reform movements. We saw again just a year ago the degree to which the Iranian public is disillusioned with the regime. I think there's been some tendency for people to say after those protests last year fizzled out that, well, this is just one more blip on the screen. But the regime is really in, I think, a very, very serious crisis. Even Ray's wife, Suzanne Maloney, who is another Iran expert, but whose views sometimes differ from ours, has, I thought, a fascinating piece that she's just written about the degree to which the regime is in serious trouble, and anybody who underestimates that underestimates it at their peril. And finally, pushing back against Iranian expansion throughout the region, and that is something where I think we've been headed in the wrong direction for a number of years, both under President Obama and now under President Trump, who largely has continued and in some ways accelerated some of the tendencies of the Obama policy. So our call is for a more comprehensive approach that seeks to change Iranian behavior in the hope that ultimately the regime itself will change to be commensurate with what appear to be the public desire for a more open and democratic society. Ray, do you want to?
I don't have much to add to what Eric said. I would say in terms of what Eric talked about making some connection with internal democratic forces. I mean, everybody talks about solidarity as a model. I'm not sure if it applies to this case. I think when Ronald Reagan was inaugurated, Solidarity had like 5 million members. So he didn't invent the organization. But if you kind of look at the '79 revolution and look at one thing very specifically, which we can with the documentation that's available, is when they had protests in the streets, who came up with the slogans, what they carry? Death to Shah, that's easy. But independence, freedom, Islamic government, these may be simple, but somebody came up with them. There was a committee that actually came up with those slogans. And then they went to the mosque, because everybody kind of understood what the slogans were that they would use, and you saw them used across the country, up and down. If you look at the protests that Eric talked about last January, December, and if you look at those protests, they were in a number of cities. They all use the same slogans. Who came up with them? Death to Khomeini, that's easy. No Palestinianization of our foreign policy. That's a slogan. Somebody came up with it. Somebody dispersed it. It was used in a number of cities at the same time. It leads me to there's some sort of organization there. Now, it may be quite nebulous. Maybe given the surveillance of the state, it comes together and disperses. But there is, I think, more of a domestic organization than we think. And if
Get Out of Syria was another one of the slogans.
yeah, I mean, somebody comes up with that stuff because it's used almost at the same time in 35 cities. Now, with the advent of social media, you can kind of pass your messages on quickly, but these things, we always think of them as kind of spontaneously erupt and then they go back because of some grievance at the time. I just think there's some sort of a nebulous organization behind it, and if you can find out who it is, how it is, then there's something to work with, I think.
Great. I'm going to try to talk for just 2 or 3 minutes, a little bit of a summary of the book itself, of elements that I think are important, and then ask a few questions, and we'll do that for about 20 minutes, and then the rest of the time will be Q&A. Let me start by saying that despite the mild manner of the 2 individuals here, this book is very incendiary. So don't be surprised when you read it to feel like you've got a different perspective on Iran than you had
Eric's
before.
responsible for the incendiaries.
Yes.
I tried to modulate it.
But as I read it, I've been reading a lot of 18th century American revolutionary stuff. It reminded me of Thomas Paine's Common Sense, in the sense that it's basically a call to wake up America and smell the coffee. Then the coffee here is that Iran still has revolutionary goals to spread its ideology through, and its religion, of course, through the Middle East. And therefore, if we don't wake up to this, it'll be like not waking up to the Soviet threat in 1945-46. And in terms of spectrums here, this is a strong call for a hardline policy against Iran. Again, equivalent and parallels are made through the book to what we did under Truman against the Soviets, or what we did under Reagan against the Soviets. And in that sense, it's firmly in this so-called classical realist logic, where the potential adversary, is not seen as someone we can work with, or at least the leadership, but is seen as having evil designs or evil intentions. And whenever they seem to be cooperative, they're really just biding their time for their next round of hardline policies that are against U.S. interests. So keep that in mind, because I think it's important to understand where this book is coming from, but also what it's trying to tell the current administration, that we failed on Iran for the last 2 administrations, and that we have to therefore understand what Iran is really up to. Let's just straightforwardly say, its religious extremist leaders would want to spread terrorism and undermine stability in the Middle East so that they can take advantage of that instability. So let me just say, first of all, that there's much of I agree with here. One is that the Iranian religious elites do tend to still have a desire to spread their revolution, or more importantly perhaps, to consolidate it at home and try to convince a largely secularized young society that the goals of the original revolution in 79, 80 are still viable and still important. I also agree that hardline policies, I'm a realist myself, hardline policies can have very beneficial effects. They can deter aggressive states. And I do see what they're talking about, the adventurism, you might call it, in Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, and so forth. But the real crux of the issue for me is, to what extent is this a true major threat that we have to react to like we did to Stalin? And to what extent are our policies, that is hardline policies that they recommend, actually good for that situation, or might actually exacerbate an instability and mistrust in the region that could spiral to something like war? So that's really the crux of it. It's not what kind of state we're dealing with, it's what kind of best strategies we should put forward to deal with this. And I'll remind people that under Reagan finally decided that he wanted a more soft line policy after 85. And therefore accommodated Gorbachev, yes, but a Gorbachev who was still saying he was a Leninist. So let's keep that in mind. Now, very briefly, I'll frame how I'm going to ask the questions by saying that I think there are at least 3 concerns I have with the book that I want to get out onto our discussion. The first is that there's a tension within the book that's not really recognized. One is that we as analysts or policymakers are under the delusion that Iran is a divided country, and therefore we can play to the moderates or play to certain more less religious factions. Whereas the book makes a big point of saying, no, it's a highly ideological state, and that the mullahs and the right-wing fanaticists, the theocrats, still run the state. But they also talk a lot about the divides within Iranian society, including the revolutions or the green movements and the highly disillusioned masses, you might say, who don't really believe in the religious views. So there really is a divide, and I'm going to ask a question about that in a second. The second point I would say is, well, how good is the parallel to the Cold War? Because communism was a universal threat, an ideology that appealed to pretty well anyone who was dissatisfied with liberalism. Well, here we've got, and they emphasize this, we've got a state that is emphasizing Shia Islamic fundamentalism against the majority Sunni religion in the Middle East. It's also Persian, so there's an ethnic divide that they highlight, and Arab, as they point out, Arab Shias don't necessarily think of Iran as a valuable state, or at least as a state that they want to cozy up to. And the third point that they make is that adventurism, just like the Soviets, adventurism is highly costly for the Iranians. It costs them a lot of money and actually undermines the regime. Well, in that sense, the question comes back to the how big is the threat question. If they're undermining their own regime by doing these adventurisms, why don't we just kind of let them do it like we did with the Soviets in Cuba, which ended up costing the Soviets and led to, you might say, the end of the Cold War. Not just Cuba, of course, but adventurism in general. All right, so that's sort of my role, my framework here, is that there's some tensions and trade-offs that are not recognized in the books, and including the role of the U.S. in all of this. To what extent does the U.S. invasion of Iran, a neighbor of Iraq, the invasion in 2003, to what extent does that actually exacerbate the tensions and make the Ayatollahs and the religious elites have something to hold on to when they try to promote an anti-U.S. worldview? So there's a back and forth here between U.S. hardline policies and that mistrust that allows these Ayatollahs to stay in power that I don't think is really captured. So let's turn to direct questions, and we'll see what the responses are. I think the first question I would have is, how big a threat really is Iran? In other words, relative to other things that we could worry about, North Korea, Russia, China, Saudi Arabia, and Wahhabism, how big is Iran in our general equation? And should we be putting military force into this region at the expense of some other potential threats? Everything's a trade-off. And this also includes grappling with this problem that Iran is a Persian country, not Arab, therefore, and Shia, not Sunni, and therefore is not necessarily appealing to those in the region. All right.
Well, let me start, and Ray, again, will drop in. First of all, it's a great question, Dale, and it's a fair one. So we have formally now a national security strategy and a national defense strategy that in fact continues a trend that became visible in the last year or two of the Obama administration, which says that we basically have three regions of the world where a balance of power is vital for the U.S. to maintain the global order that we largely created in 1945 and have maintained ever since. The Far East with China, Europe with Russia, and the Middle East, where, as I think Ray and I were suggesting in our opening remarks, and as you rightly point out, we say in the book, Iranian policy is the driving force for not all, but quite a bit of the problem. Let me stipulate, as lawyers would say, that the Iranian challenge is nothing like the scale of the Soviet challenge, for precisely the reasons you raise. It's not a universalistic movement with pretensions to represent the future of all the workers of the world. However, having said that, it's not a trivial challenge either, because the Iranians, despite the debilities that you mentioned, still believe that their revolution is meant to be a global one. And the role that they've played, despite the Sunni-Shia divide, in galvanizing Islamic extremism in the region is enormous. It's transcended just the Shia world, and it's one reason why Iran has shown itself so able to play a role across the region, and why they're able to play on the Sunni-Shia splits, but not just the Sunni-Shia splits. They've also become very large sponsors for Hamas, for Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and so they're able to transcend the purely Sunni-Shia divide. I would also add that they are engaged in activity through Hezbollah that ranges further afield. I mean, it was Iran that was involved, and as I mentioned, in the synagogue bombing in Argentina. They've been involved in terrorist activities in Europe, notably in Berlin. They're right now people, as we were discussing before we started the event today, there is a small but not insignificant Iranian presence in Venezuela, where the major foreign presence is Cuban and Russian. But it's I think again an indication that their ambitions range much further. And so I think it is a challenge that as long as we want to try and maintain some kind of stability in the region and ideally draw down our presence in the region. I agree it would be wonderful if we could, because I think China and Russia in the long run are more significant challenges, but we can't do that in the absence of getting some kind of stable equilibrium there, and we're far from that at this point.
Cool.
Well, we can go back to some of the other points in a minute.
Let me, I largely agree with Eric, but let me just pick up on the theme of internal divisions. Because if you kind of look at the evolution of the Islamic Republic over 40 years, what you have seen is the regime had a lot of internal divisions. In the 1990s, the Islamic Republics probably produced the most intellectually scintillating reform movement, certainly in Iran, if not in the modern Middle East, an attempt to sort of harmonize religion with democratic values, the sort of a presidency of Muhammad Khatami. And if you kind of think about the political system in its most simplest term, the left, the right, and the center, the left, which was always the most legitimate aspect of the Iranian political system, has been largely excised from the body politic. The regime no longer has the aspirations of the Khatami era in attempting to sort of make the Islamic Republic anchor it on some measure of democratic accountability. The center, as represented by President Rouhani, has been largely discredited today because it essentially tried to offer the Iranian public a model whereby they exchange political passivity for economic dividends. Political passivity was insisted upon, and economic rewards never came. So the only thing that's left in the body politic, in the system, nizam, is the right. And the right does have its own ideological predilections that tend to be very much relying on the original message and values of the revolution. It has its own economic perspective, which is insular and isolationist and away from European commerce and Western markets. It has its own declared orientation. They talk about an Eastern orientation. China, Russia, Central Asia, Afghanistan, and so on as the commerce, as the basis of the economic system. So at this point, what we see in a system that has often been described as factionalized is it's becoming more disciplined because of just sheer excising and purging. Now, I don't think any political system benefits from purging because I think it leads to some intellectual sterilization, and that's something is happening in the Islamic Republic. The divide today is not within the regime, but between state and society, which they tend to move further apart as the regime consolidates itself along very fundamental revolutionary values. As far as the threat it represents, that examples of the Cold War, it's very difficult for me to talk about the Cold War and the models of it with Mel Leffler in the room because I don't want to make any mistakes. But I would say that Islamic Republic never said that our revolution is a Shiite one. It said it's an Islamic one. The people who accused it of sectarianism were the Saudis. And today, even if you accept that the message of the Iranian regime it's mostly popular in Shi'i enclaves, that Shi'i enclave has dramatically enlarged. In the Gulf region, the majority of the population is actually Shiite. In Iraq and so on. So even if the message is more of a sectarian one, that sectarian appeal has become more fundamental given the collapse of the state structure in the Middle East. And the Islamic Republic is always better with dealing with non-state actors than it does with state actors. In the entire Shah's tenure, he had good relationship with Egypt, Turkey, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, because he was a source of stability in the Middle East. Islamic Republic has had bad relations with nearly all its neighbors, because it's always been a source of challenging the order of the region. So even if this message is a Shi'i sectarian one, that message far more resonates in an order, particularly in the most important sub-region of the Middle East, which is, in my opinion, the Gulf, is far more significant and challenging in that respect. Finally, I would say that an Iranian regime would be greatly offended by this, but the model of imperialism that they have developed is very much similar to the British one, which essentially relies on Afghans and Pakistanis and Hezbollah fighters to do a lot of it sort of has its own imperial auxiliary force. Iraqis to do is fighting for it. So it's developed kind of a cheap model of imperialism, as the British did. They would be extraordinarily, as I said, offended by that comparison. But they have no problems with Pakistani Shiites killing Syrian Sunnis or developing. But one of the things that they have done, which is extraordinarily clever, is they always go into a state, and they did this with Lebanon in the 1980s, Iraq today, and Syria as well, is they immediately develop a paramilitary structure outside the control of the state. Hezbollah outside the control of Lebanese government. Iraqi militias outside the control of the Iraqi government. And this was a period of tension between the Iranian regime and the Syrian Assad regime in 2011, when the civil war broke out. The Iranian estimate at that time differed from the American estimate. The Iranian estimate was Assad would survive. And they proved right. And they went in and said to the Assad regime, let us develop militias for you. And Assad said, no, help me strengthen my army. And they said, no, we can develop a militiaman in 3 days. To train your army, it takes 2 years. And they have developed these auxiliary forces that are moving around. I mean, Hezbollah is a regional force, is presence everywhere. So this model allows it to project power in a manner which is not economically without burdens, but is certainly better than the way Americans would do it.
Well, I'm going to open it up in just a second. I just want to frame one more thing that I think is relevant, because after all, in the end, we're talking about what should the U.S. do? And on the hardline, softline spectrum, how hardline should it be? For example, if this policy that they're advocating doesn't work, should we go to war? Should we do it 2003 again? Is it that kind of a threat? Or is it something like, well, let's try this, and if it doesn't work, let's go back to the old policy? But I think what we have to do, therefore, is understand, and we can open it up to discussion perhaps here, we have to understand how big is the threat and what is the downside of going too hard line. Is there a feedback effect, in other words, like we saw after 2003, where the U.S. policy actually alienates what could be our best allies in the region, especially those who are, because they're Arab, are against the Persian dominance, or because they're smaller, are against a state that's 3 or 4 times the size of any other state in the region. So, I mean, at least Iraq. So we have to understand those kinds of feedback effects and not just simply say, it's a threat, let's do the hard line. I think we have to be subtle. But I'm looking at the clock here and realizing we've got 25 minutes. I want to make sure everyone has a chance. Maybe we'll have a chance at the end to talk more, but I want to make sure everyone in the audience has a chance. So let's open it up for discussion. Just put up your hand and there'll be a microphone coming around.
So you faulted the Obama administration for forging a nuclear deal that isolated, or forging a deal that isolated nuclear weapons from everything else, including ballistic missiles. And we've now pulled out of that deal. At the time, I remember hearing a diplomat say that the nuclear deal could be a foundation for further negotiations with Iran. But we've obviously abandoned that position. We're out of the deal. Mike Pence is chastising the British and the French for not joining us and imposing new sanctions on Iran. I just wonder where you stand. I mean, you seem to be talking about a hard line here and not negotiating. How do you stand on the future of the nuclear deal?
Well, I think one of the things that's really striking about the situation since President Trump announced the U.S. withdrawal from the deal is the fact that Iran, now a year later, almost a year later, is still in the deal, which tells you something. It tells you that this deal was incredibly beneficial and generous to Iran, because if that were not the case, they would have taken the opportunity to get out of the deal and its restraints themselves. The problem with the deal is that it left, as you mentioned in your question, the ballistic missile program essentially untouched, which progresses apace. And one of the things one, I think, has to bear in mind is that there's, I believe that, someone may contradict me, but I believe it's a fact that no country has developed a ballistic missile program of the scale and scope of Iran's program without also developing a nuclear weapon to deliver it with, because ballistic missiles don't really do much for you absent some warhead on it that can deliver a weapon of mass destruction. The second point, as I mentioned earlier, is the timelines. President Obama himself mentioned that because of these timelines and the industrial scale enrichment capability that the deal permitted to continue to exist, and the fact that Iran is allowed under the terms of the deal to engage in research and development of more advanced centrifuges, which is ongoing, means that when the deal timelines expire variously in 8, 10, and 15 years, and these are President Obama's words, they will be days away from having a nuclear weapon. So I think Ray and I consistently have felt that the deal was insufficient to truly constrain Iran in the long run. And as I said, you know, it's very easy to say 10, 15 years. You know, we're already 5 years in. And so the clock is really ticking, you know, on this deal. Now, there are a couple of different ways that one might approach it. One might try and get Iran to agree to make these limitations permanent, for instance. I mean, the other critique I should have said is that the deal did not make Iran actually own up to its so-called PMD, previous military dimensions of its nuclear program, which means that although you keep reading in the newspapers that the IAEA is saying that they remain within the terms of the deal, if you don't have an adequate baseline for verification, it's very difficult to actually say with any meaningful sense that the deal is being adhered to, because you don't know what you're measuring it against. So those deficiencies remain. One could argue that you could try and get them to agree to anywhere, anytime inspections. You could try to get them to agree to make these 10 and 15-year limitations permanent. You could try to see if you could get them not to, experiment with more advanced centrifuges that cut the amount of time necessary to produce fissile material. There's absolutely no indication that Iran would be very interested in doing that.
Yes. Oh, sure. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry, I'm short. You mentioned along the way dissenters within the Iranian population. It seems like a major amount of Iranians are 30 or younger. And so my question to you is, how does this factor into, coupled with social media, what do you see the youth of Iran doing? How do you project this out, let's say even 10 years from now? Because I don't think these people are going to sit idly.
The Islamic Republic is one of the most unusual governments around, to say the least, because it constantly manufactures statistics. It kind of uses statistics as adjectives. It would be Robert McNamara's dream palace. They just spew out statistics. And the statistics often undermine its own claims to legitimacy. It's the Islamic Republic. There's an organization that estimates how many people attend mosques. Nobody. How many people attend mosques on commemoration days? Very few. What's the level of sexual intercourse among teenagers? Through the roof. What's the level of religiosity among there's an organization that, given the surveillance, that estimates, that publishes statistics all the time about the disenchantment of the population across demographics with the sort of a religious enforcement of the regime. With the advent of social media, which is quite accessible in the country, you begin to see, even before that, a level of secularism that could only come about when you kind of living under a theocratic system for a very long time. Now the question has always been, does all this discontent lead to some sort of an uprising that could sustain itself and topple the regime? And that's the question. Almost nobody, whatever political coloration they are, will tell you that there's no discontent in Iran. They will always stipulate that. Then they will stipulate that the regime has endured for 40 years, it has overcome many crises, therefore it can manage the crises of discontent that you're talking about that is available and documented. You can say that if you roll the tape back and you had that same meeting in 1978, 77, they will say the same thing about the Shah's regime. Now, that doesn't mean they're wrong this time, but one should, in dealing with a system as volatile as that, quite often turns assumptions into questions. I think there's a real question regarding the durability of the regime, given the gap between state and society that's not bridging, that's enlarging. And I would say that we'll see the day when we will get to the post-Islamic Republic era. If the only thing they are relying on is security services, then they have nothing left. Because security services in a situation of a national uprising are likely to be underutilized and ineffective. Hosni Mubarak had 1 million people just in his intelligence services. He had more people in intelligence services than protesters. Again, China has distorted our impression because what they did in Tiananmen Square, which is very controversial within China itself, within the Politburo and between the Politburo and the military, is not something that I think other countries can replicate. Most countries, militaries, even ideological one, don't like to shoot at their people. And the Islamic Republic has the same hesitation in that respect, in my view, that the Shah's army did.
Eric, I want to pick up on this because I think it's an important aspect, and it's a tension, again, that I feel in the book between, at the start of the book, talking about how incredibly powerful this religious revolutionary force is within the country, and yet near the end of the book, you're talking, as you do now, about the dissatisfaction of the vast majority of the people, especially the young people, but the majority who don't even attend the mosques. They don't seem to be buying into, or they haven't drunk the Kool-Aid, or if they drank it, they survived. And what I find problematic about that is if it's this latter story that you're telling, that in fact this is a divided state, this is a state where, I don't know, let's say 70–80% of the people don't really buy the story of the revolution and its wonders and its benefits, and perhaps not even the idea of an afterlife. It strikes me that this is actually suggestive more of the Ronald Reagan after 1985 rather than the Ronald Reagan of 1981–82. Namely, cozy up to not cozy up, that's the wrong word, but work with this state. Use carrots and sticks, not just sticks, and say to this regime and make it very public that we are not against you, we are not trying to destroy you per se, and even if we are trying to foment a social revolution, and simply allow the state to collapse on its own merits. This is not the kind of threat that the first half of the book seems to suggest. This is the kind of state that is already decaying because it can't get its economic act together. It's got the secular religious divide. It's got the dissatisfaction and delegitimation of the regime. The Green Revolution could easily come back or the Green Movement, I should say, from 2009. And it also reminds me again of the Soviet Union and the fall there. Let's not forget, and this is actually a great documentary by A&E on how rock and roll and the Beatles in particular had an undermining effect on the youth culture in the Soviet Union and actually helped lead to the end of the regime in 1990. We have the same thing going on here with the social media as this lady asked. So I want you guys to address this more directly, the tension within the book, because it strikes me that it would actually encourage not a hardline policy, which would only get the U.S. back into the great Satan mode, but rather a more carrots and sticks kind of approach.
I think the distinction here, Dale, and again, Ray is more expert on this than I.
3 more questions.
Okay. I'm wondering if maybe we can have a question you can answer.
Okay, I'll try and answer.
I shouldn't have talked. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Rahim Hamid. I am human rights activist and former political prisoner from Iran. I am from Ahwazi Arab minority in southwest of Iran. I just want to clarify a few points about the things that you have mentioned. You have always mentioned that Iran is a Persian state. Actually, if you look carefully, if you read the Iran geography, Iran is formed from 5 or 6 ethnic minority. They are not minority. They are minority in their ruling the country. They are minority. They are marginalized. The Ahwazi Arab, Kurdish people, Baluchi people, Azeri people, and Turkmen. And the other thing that I want to say, Iran is not going to be reformed. We as a non-Persian ethnic minorities, we are demanding the activation of the articles of Iran that is stipulating the supporting and recognizing the right of non-Persian people, such as right to education in mother language. But they didn't do that, and instead they violate their own constitution. And when we demand it, we will be accused of being conspired with Saudi Arabia and the Israel country. The other thing, if there is any change in the country, the ethnic minority will have a powerful rule because they fed up with the Persian-centric rule, and we want to have our self-autonomy, something that Kurdish people are demanding. So I'm just hoping that the foreign policy in the U.S. not going to victimize us in the future and only going to be allied with the Persian opposition. Iran opposition also is diverse. Arab, Kurd, Baluchi, the things that I want to stress. It's very vital and very critical point that I hope that you consider it in the future. Thank you, guys.
I think we say something about that in the book.
You wanted,
Let it just go ahead.
maybe we get one more question and then.
Well, we've got 3 people waiting, so whatever.
Okay, why don't we have 2 more questions and
Hopefully
then we
this will-
can have the.
Hopefully this, I don't think this is on, is it? Hopefully this won't be too long. First of all, it's an excellent presentation. My question is this: what is the role of Saudi Arabia in all this? Because a lot of Americans sit back and say, oh, we should let the Saudis take care of this and wait and see what happens.
And one more question, perhaps?
Thank you, thank you. Actually, we have 2 more.
Oh, okay, good, 2 more. Why don't we clear the deck?
Good, thank you, thank you.
Hi, Ray, welcome back. You probably don't remember me, but I remember you when you were here 10 years ago, and I do remember that Rui Ramazani, and I appreciated you remembered him, that he had endorsed your book then. I haven't read your new book yet, although I've read the opening and some excerpts, and I need to read more of it. So, and I hope we don't have to wait 10 years before we have another conversation, maybe before your next book. But honestly, I know Rui's work pretty well. Going back to 1984, I was with Ken Thompson before that, and there's so many things that you've said that I probably would agree with and would love to have more of a discussion. But I'm intrigued about your articulation, your strategy, and I know Professor Copeland was getting to it. If from what I'm reading, I think what you're arguing is incendiary. So I'm going to offer maybe an incendiary response if Rui was here, I mean, if I'm understanding what you're arguing, and correct me if I'm wrong, you're talking about all these myths that have been guiding foreign policy, U.S.'s approach to Iran. And I'm thinking, it sounds like, if I'm reading it, that those myths are precisely the things that Rui Ramazani was arguing that we needed to be doing vis-a-vis Iran. And just one final observation, again, you can respond to it. You mentioned that the current, those who would have supported the Green Wave, those moderate forces within the regime, that they're very much on the out now. The only thing I would have added on that, part of the reason they're on the outs right now, the sense that they didn't deliver the goods from the nuclear deal, is the perception that the Trump administration's rejection of the agreement, the attempt to put all these pressures on, it's easy for the hardliners to just simply say, the reason we haven't been able, that Iran is suffering such maladies today is precisely because the U.S. has reneged on the deal. Anyway, thanks. Welcome back.
Thank you very much for coming today. Appreciate it. When Obama signed the nuclear deal, there was a lot of discussion of whether or not they should include the hostages coming back. And John Kerry said no. What is the bargaining chip that Trump has now to get some of the Americans that are sitting in jails in Iran to get them back?
Great. So why don't we have the panelists respond to anything that they've heard so far?
Okay, let me try and, as best I can, in various order. On the question that you raised, Dale, about the tension between a regime that is united and a society that is divided. I think part of what Ray and I were trying to argue is that American policymakers have looked at the real, there's no doubt that they're real, factional differences among Iranian political leaders and sought to manipulate them as part of efforts to engage the Islamic Republic, going back to the negotiations we carried out to get the hostages released in 1979, and have come a cropper almost always because the divisions really are about domestic politics. They're not really about foreign policy, and therefore they're not really manipulable in the way that American diplomats have traditionally thought they were. And I think that's, I think, a non-trivial point to make. The division that you talk about really is between state and society. It's not within the state structure itself. And that's an argument, I think, for what we do advocate, which is essentially a long twilight struggle, as John Kennedy might have said, for regime change. My SAIS colleague, Michael Mandelbaum, has a piece this month in commentary called in praise of regime change, and he basically is talking about Venezuela, Iran, Russia, and China. And what he says is, these are not, we're not talking about, forcible regime change a la Iraq 2003, to get back to one of your other questions, but trying to set the conditions and manipulate the variables we can control, including cost imposition on things like overextension and overreach, in order to accelerate the processes that are already going on in those countries that are likely to lead to peaceful political change, or maybe not so peaceful, depending on how the authorities play it. On the question of minorities, I don't think there's any doubt that Iran has minority populations that are not benefiting from the regime. We talk about that as part of the overall strategy that trying to address those communities' legitimate needs is something that we need to make the Iranian government answerable for. On the question of leaving it to the Saudis, this is one reason why I think it's going to be very difficult for us to extricate ourselves from this region. Because the problem is, if we leave our friends and allies out there to their own devices, they're going to do things we don't like. And they're going to do it without benefit of our counsel and our advice. And more often than not, they will create a mess that we will then have to try somehow to clean up. So I would rather not, just sort of leave it to them. On the hostages, I think one of the worst aspects of the JCPOA is something I actually had to testify about in front of the Senate Banking Committee in the fall of 2016, which is the fact that as part of the deal, we did in fact return funds to the Islamic Republic in order to get hostages back. And while there was a lot of obfuscation about whether this was, a cash for hostages deal, there were pallets of money on the runway, and the timing was set to make sure that the hostages were released. And the worst part of that is what we've done essentially is incentivize the Islamic Republic to take more hostages. The president, to his credit, and I'm not, as many, those of you who know me, I signed all 4 Never Trump letters, so I'm not normally predisposed to give the Trump administration much credit for anything. But the president has made it a point to try and get Americans who are being held by the government of Turkey, by the government of Egypt, and elsewhere out, and has succeeded on some occasions. I think he hasn't always done it in the best way, but he has tried to do it. And I don't know that we have a lot of leverage right now with Iran to try and get the remaining hostages out.
Let me begin by addressing the Ruhi question, the Ruhi Ramazani question. Ruhi was a great man. And I think Ruhi would actually disagree with a lot of what I'm saying. I mean, at some point he and I were in contact, and he summoned me to Charlottesville to explain myself. And he passed away and he was ill health for a while. I think the criticism that Ruhi would make of this case that Eric and I are making, the criticism that others make, should be taken very seriously and should be considered very seriously. And if you opt for the arguments that Ruhi would have made, then I think that's a perfectly legitimate position to take. So I do think that nobody should just accept what we say, but you should consider what people of extraordinary authority, like Ruhi, would have said. And Ruhi would disagree with all this. To be fair to him, and I think his criticism should be taken seriously and considered. And we never had a chance, Ruhi and I, to talk it out. But I have often thought about it on the drive today, what would Ruhi say if he was here today? And he would not be, he was very trenchant in his criticism, and he would offer that criticism, and that criticism had to be taken very seriously given his stature, his authority, and a lifetime of devotion. And other people make similar criticism of us as well, and that criticism has to be taken seriously and not just dismissed. I deal with the one question that you had, Dale, about what works best with this regime, détente or confrontation. And I'll do so with deference to Professor Loeffler, because to me it's an open question. I have asked people about this who know more than I do, and you certainly do more than I do, is did détente prolong the life of the Soviet Union? I kind of think it did. So the policy that you're suggesting, to me, I'm open to what others of far greater authority than I do. I think détente actually contributed to prolongation of the Soviet Empire, with the credits, infusion of economics, and so on. So in that sense, I don't see that particular practice that you're suggesting as leading to the demise of the regime, but prospectively to its prolongation. But I'm open to arguments to the contrary that may be aired by others. I want to end with a point that was made about the Americans that are in Iran. And I think there's quite a few of them now. And one of them, since we are at a university, is a PhD student, Chinese-American PhD student, working on Qajar dynasty. And he was arrested and imprisoned for 10 years for spying on behalf of British Museum and John Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, not even Princeton. And I think that's something that has to be uppermost in people's minds. I don't know what the answer is to have to extricate them, given how controversial it became, the President Obama's attempt to extricate the Iranians with pallets of money. I don't think anybody's going to go down that road again. But that's something that has to be considered. I do know that Trump administration people have brought this up with Iranians when they encountered them in the Joint Nuclear Agreements Commission. And I think Iranians were quite defiant at that time. The favorite talking point of the Iranian foreign minister is, we have an independent judiciary, I have nothing to do with it. But I do know that that issue has come up, and thus far, there's no indication of relief for those individuals. And you're quite right, whoever it was, I'm sorry, to bring this up, because it's an important issue.
Well, we're running out of time here. I'll just say in conclusion that I actually think we're moving towards perhaps not a middle ground, but an understanding of some of the parameters or variables that are very important to take into consideration. In other words, a subtle policy or a good policy which understands the complexity of this situation, understands that perhaps diplomacy is a mix of carrots and sticks. It is an attempt to achieve regime change, which I think we agree. I think there's also agreement here that we're not advocating, or I think the authors are not advocating a return to preventive war 2003 against Iran. They're suggesting, as I think we all agree, that there must be, or there should be, a way to perhaps effect or bring about regime change within Iran. The real question then becomes, what kind of mix, relative mix, of carrots and sticks should we have? And how do we avoid, for example, looking like the great Satan when we actually implement a policy towards this? But I would like you to join me in thanking our two panelists and two speakers. And there's a book signing. I should